ask, why does it seem like when you make your voting decisions, they're based on capital rather than the working class? Billionaires and corporations got their tax issues enshrined into law forever, but the working class gets a no tax on tips or overtime that only applies to some of us, and now we wind up in a situation where we are.
With all due respect, sir, the Republican Party now more than ever represents the heart and soul of the working class.
That's about how it's going to be a Republican right now in America, not just in America, but in Ruby Red, Nebraska. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in the East. That was a little peek into a red district in Nebraska, Congressional District number 1, where the Republican there, Mike Flood, who you saw scrolling through his notes looking for how to answer an angry constituent, won with 60% of the vote. We showed you a little bit in the last hour, but last night at an in-person town hall, Flood's constituents took him to task over and over. It only took 2 minutes for tensions to heighten, particularly over new Republican spending bills.
I want to go right into this bill because I know this is something a lot of people have questions about. And quite frankly, from where I sit, there's been a lot of misinformation out there about the bill.
The crowd of about 750 people in attendance voiced its discontent on a variety of issues, from the ICE detentions to veterans care to the nation's debt. But health care was a huge part of their discontent.
Would you sign on or write up a bill for Medicare for all? We've got Medicare now. We can start rolling back the age 5, 10 years at a time. Would you support that?
We can't afford that.
Yes, you can.
One of those changes is that if you are able to work and you are able-bodied, you have to work. If you choose not to work, you do not get free health care. You do not get free health care. Okay. So here's a question. Do you think that people who are 28 years old that can work and refuse to work should get free health care? I don't think that a majority of Nebraskans agree with you. I truly believe this bill protects Medicaid for the future. I believe it.
The message coming from these town hall attendees, loud and clear there, heard it for yourself. These voters in Ruby Red, Nebraska are not happy with the Republican brand, the Republican Party, the Republican representative, and his practice of blindly rubber stamping all of Donald Trump's policies and practices, especially the parts that undermine American democracy. Watch this.
With $450 million FEMA dollars being reallocated to open Alligator Alcatraz and $600 million taxpayer FEMA dollars being used to now open more concentration camps, and ICE burning through $8.4 million a day to illegally detain people, how much does it cost for fascism? How much do the taxpayers have to pay for a fascist country?
Americans went to the polls in November, and they had a choice between a Democratic candidate that had an open border, no enforcement, fentanyl, drugs, human trafficking. And they had a choice between that and a candidate that said, close the border, get illegal immigrants out of our country.
It is notable that the congressman held an in-person town hall meeting at all after facing a tough one back in May, and after leaders of his party advised Republicans against holding town hall meetings. But what we saw is symptomatic of a larger dynamic all across the country, that the party in power, the Republican Party, and the president who leads it, Donald Trump, are deeply, deeply unpopular in deep red parts of the country. What we saw could be a harbinger for next year's midterm elections. Here's how Flood's town hall meeting ended.
It is an honor to serve you and a privilege to serve you in the United States Congress. Thank you very much, and have a safe drive home.
It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Host of the Fast Politics podcast, Vanity Fair special correspondent, MSNBC political analyst Molly Jong-Fast is here. Also joining us, MSNBC senior political analyst Matt Dowd is here. And lucky for us, the president of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone, is still with us. Matt Dowd, I start with you because I feel like you and I have sat at this uncomfortable corner between trying to understand public opinion that exists and, in a campaign context, trying to move public opinion around where it could be moved. It feels like Trump and the Republicans have entered a cul-de-sac, and where public opinion exists is that the voters have woken up to, not all of them, but a lot of voters have woken up to the fact that Donald Trump's DOGE cuts are bad for everyone, including veterans, that Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill kicks a whole bunch of people off of Medicaid and hurts a whole bunch of people, and that the Epstein conspiracy theory was peddled for political gain, and there's no plan to be transparent about it. You pick up those three things loud and clear from this town hall. They are known by the voters. They are known by Republican voters. And it feels like it will be very difficult for Republicans to put the toothpaste back in the tube. What do you hear from watching these town halls?
Well, I'm always a believer, that anecdotes are interesting and fun, and a town hall is an anecdote. And if by itself, I would say, oh, the town hall, there's just a bunch of people showed up and were mad. But the anecdote matters when it's combined with data. And so the town halls that we're seeing that the Republicans are having to face with all of this anger is a reflection of all of the public opinion polls. And all of the public opinion polls show Donald Trump the most unpopular president at this point in time in his history. The Republican Party is unpopular. And in fact, that they took an unpopular president with an unpopular party and then pushed an unpopular bill, a highly unpopular bill. What did they think was going to happen when they did that? And that's what the fascinating thing about this. And so the outcome of all of that is these town halls, and the Republicans that do, God bless them for holding a town hall in the midst of this. They're holding these town halls, and they're seeing the reflection of where the public is on this. The other thing I think that a town hall shows, and to me, it reminds me a little of what happened in 2010, where there was a lot of town halls that showed up at Democratic districts with Democratic politicians that began to reflect, and you basically understood what was about to happen in November of that year, which was a horrible election for Democrats in 2010, and they lost the House in that election. That's what we're beginning to see. And the piece of data I think a town hall can tell you about is enthusiasm. And what I think all of the things you mentioned, ICE, the bill, everything that's happened, and now Epstein, it's all of it is a deflating mechanism for the Republican Party and an inflating mechanism for the Democratic Party in the course of this. And there we see a town hall that basically shows all of that in spades.
Matt, what do you, I agree with you about, and I think what's so precious when you hear voters in their own words confronting the people that they may have voted for. I mean, at the Grassley town hall meetings, they were calling him Chuck. I mean, he's represented some of his constituents for decades. They were confronting him about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and they seemed to not believe his stories around immigration. When you hear the voters in their own words talking about their discontent with the overreaches of ICE, when you hear them talking about the cuts to the government and services, and when you hear them talking about the Epstein scandals, do you hear a bigger, do you hear sort of like a breaking off of the coalition, or do you hear members within the coalition simply expressing discontent?
Well, it's a great question. And I think what I'm hearing is how far ahead voters are from their politicians. and how far ahead Democratic average voters are ahead of many of the Democratic elected officials in the course of this. Democratic elected officials have started figuring out, and I know we'll talk about this topic in a bit about the redistricting in Texas, are starting to catch up to where voters are. But that, to me, is what we're seeing. I mean, we've seen this before. You and I have seen this in the midst of campaigns where you can be tepid in the midst of a campaign, or a politician can be tepid, and then they figure out how far voters are ahead of them, and then they have to run and catch up to where voters are. I don't think there's any division in the Democratic Party right now, among the millions of Democratic voters. They oppose everything that Donald Trump does. They can't stand all the stuff that happened to ICE. They're upset about the Epstein stuff. They're upset about what the judiciary branch has been doing. They're upset about all of it. What the Democratic voters are also upset about is, why haven't more Democratic politicians stood in the breach and felt the same emotional way they do? And that's sort of division.
Yes.
There's not a division among voters. There's a division between voters and some Democratic politicians.
We're following breaking news in the Jeffrey Epstein case. MSNBC has just confirmed that the Justice Department is considering releasing the audio and/or the transcript of Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche's interview with Ghislaine Maxwell. That's according to an official familiar with the matter. Joining us now, MSNBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, NBC News Chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Ken, tell us more about your reporting.
Good afternoon, Chris. Well, as everyone recalls, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche interviewed Ghislaine Maxwell over 9 hours, over 2 days last month, and it was unclear exactly what he asked her and what came of that interview. But now we understand that the Justice Department has crafted a transcript. First of all, they recorded that interview. They're making a transcript of that interview, and they are now considering releasing it to the public with redactions of names and other sensitive information. And this, of course, is coming as the House Oversight Committee is subpoenaing information from the Justice Department about the Epstein case. And it appears there's a debate within the administration about how far they need to go here in releasing information. On the one hand, the controversy arguably over this, the heat on Attorney General Pam Bondi may be dying down a bit. On the other hand, the action in the House and in other places and on social media shows that there's still a lot of interest in this story and in what Ghislaine Maxwell had to say. And of course, she was moved from a low security prison to a minimum security prison without explanation. And the Bureau of Prisons had to waive a rule to do that. And so a lot of focus on what she had to say to the Justice Department. And now we're learning they are considering releasing it all to the public, Chris.
So, Lisa, would this be an unusual step?
Everything about this is unusual, dating back to the very conduct of an interview with somebody who's serving a 20-year prison sentence and wasn't talked to by prosecutors in advance, largely because they felt that she couldn't be believed. You'll remember Ghislaine Maxwell was also charged with perjury. She wasn't ultimately tried for perjury, given her convictions on other counts, but she was charged with perjury. But let's go back to the fact that the recording was made and a transcript may be released. That is also extremely unusual. I asked one victim's lawyer today what his reaction to that is, and he said, assuming that the victims' identities are protected, they would welcome the release of that transcript. And I said, well, wait a second. Don't you have any concerns about the way the interview was conducted, given that it was conducted by the Deputy Attorney General? And the response was, yes, any competent interview of Ghislaine Maxwell would be done by someone who has full familiarity with the case and the investigation, which it appears didn't happen here. But that's all the more important for us to see it. So if there is a transcript, if there is a tape, let us see it so that we can see how partial and selective the questions were to Ghislaine Maxwell to satisfy perhaps the desires of this White House.
So, Ryan, to say the least, it's been a busy day for this case. The House Oversight Chair, James Comer, just filed a bevy of subpoenas tied to the Epstein investigation. They target, among others, former President Clinton, former Secretary of State Clinton, as well as former attorneys general who served under 4 past presidents, including Donald Trump. Tell us more about this list of subpoenas.
Well, I think it tells us 2 things, Chris. The first being that there is still an appetite among House Republicans in particular to get as much information out about the Epstein controversy. This despite President Trump's attempts to try and downplay the controversy and the need for more information to get out there. House Republicans are not accepting that. They are pushing for more information. The second thing that this tells us is that this has the potential, and I say put an emphasis on potential, to be perhaps the most exhaustive collection of information related to the Epstein case that would be outside of the prosecutorial procedures that went into the Epstein investigation. What the Oversight Committee is asking for, first of all, is they're subpoenaing the Department of Justice for any and all records connected to the Epstein case. They're basically asking for the Epstein files. And then they're going to bring into this exhaustive list of former officials across 4 different administrations who may have at any point in time touched on this investigation and ask them very specific questions about what they knew and when they knew it. Now, whether or not they're going to be able to get every single one of these people into a room and ask them questions, that remains to be seen. Whether or not the Department of Justice is going to be completely compliant with this subpoena, that also remains to be seen. It's important to keep in mind, Chris, that while congressional subpoenas certainly carry with them a tremendous amount of legal weight, we don't have to go very far back into history to the January 6th Select Committee and saw how many Republican members of Congress essentially just ignored the subpoenas of that committee without any sort of repercussion, to know that there is an effort and an ability to challenge these subpoenas either through court or just by forcing the administration to go through the steps to force you to come in and testify. So there's a lot here that has to happen. But as I said before, it has the potential to really unlock many of the questions that people have about this case.
2 of Epstein's victims, I should say, have written scathing letters to the court condemning the Justice Department's handling of the Epstein files as political warfare. This is what one victim wrote, quote, "I am not sure the highest priority here is the victims, justice for the victims, or combating child exploitation. Rather, I feel like the DOJ's and FBI's priority is protecting the third party, the wealthy men, by focusing on scrubbing their names off the files." There is a confluence here, obviously, Lisa, of the legal and the political. The judge is supposed to rule on the law. But can he be influenced by the political firestorm or the victims and the kinds of things that they're saying in these letters?
I think he certainly will be influenced by the victims, if in no small part because they have statutory rights of their own, both rights to privacy, but they also have a right to be informed of these proceedings and to have a say in them. We learned, Chris, last night, very late last night, from the Department of Justice, that while they've notified people whose names show up in the grand jury transcripts, they have not notified all known victims of Epstein. They say they're still in the process of doing that. Well, my question to them is, what are you waiting for? The deadline for victim submissions are today. That sort of underscores the fact that they understand that the victims' own voices are a political problem for them, in addition to something that has the right to be a part of this discourse. I don't know that politics should ever enter into the consideration of a judge deciding whether or not to release grand jury materials. But some of the other factors that are permissible might be described by somebody else as political. Like, one person's victim's rights is another person's playing politics. And so I'm hopeful that the judge will take the victims' voices into consideration, but not in a way that is playing politics with people's lives, but really thoughtfully considering their trauma.
I also mentioned to you what was going on today. So there was a story in the New York Times, and many of the things we had never seen before. An exclusive inside look at Jeffrey Epstein's 7-story, 21,000 square foot Manhattan townhouse. We should note NBC News has not independently reviewed the photos shown in the New York Times reporting. We can't confirm their authenticity. But the piece says this, that in his office, Epstein showcased a green first edition of Lolita. That, of course, is the 1955 novel in which an intellectual develops a sexual obsession with a 12-year-old girl and repeatedly rapes her. My colleague, Anna Cabrera, spoke with one of the writers of that story. Take a listen.
First of all, this was kind of an open secret to anyone who visited the mansion, but also just that anyone who did come there really at least should have known. Maybe they didn't know, but they should have known that something was quite wrong with what was going on with this man and what was going on in that house. Yeah,
there were multiple examples in the story suggesting what we just heard from the writer, that there were some clues there. It drives home the point that for some, and certainly from what we read in those letters from the victims, they believe this was an open secret.
Absolutely. And it was an open secret among people who fraternized with Jeffrey Epstein as well. You know, one of the letters that the New York Times published was from Woody Allen, the filmmaker, who was talking about the kinds of meals that were held at Jeffrey Epstein's house and talked about the fact that there were always young girls around to both serve food but also sort of keep people company. So it was an open secret for quite some time. Chris, the other thing about that New York Times reporting that I find really pernicious is how openly and notoriously Jeffrey Epstein also displayed photos of himself with the world's most powerful people, as if to send a suggestion to anybody who might report him for his misdeeds. Look at who I hang out with. Look at who considers me valuable. The Pope, former presidents, some of the world's leading figures in business and science. These are my friends. This is my circle. Go at me if you dare. That in and of itself is as disturbing to me as the first edition of Lolita.
We should have many more seats in Congress, and we have an opportunity in Texas to pick up 5 seats. We have a really good governor, and we have good people in Texas, and I won Texas. I got the highest vote in the history of Texas, as you probably know, and we are entitled to 5 more seats.
Just like that, we're entitled to 5 more seats. Donald Trump has basically ordered Texas Republicans to redraw their congressional map to yield 5 more Republican seats before next year's midterms. Those Republican lawmakers are doing it. They're not even trying to hide how shady it is. They're essentially redrawing the map to create 5 more Republican districts in Texas, which means 5 more Republican congresspeople in Washington, D.C.
The proposed plan redraws, and I want everybody to know this, 37 of the 38 congressional districts to some degree. The primary changes, though, are focused on 5 districts for partisan purposes. These districts were drawn primarily using political performance. Each of these newly drawn districts now trend Republican in political performance.
5 new trending Republican districts. This is why Democrats in the Texas State House have fled to Illinois in an attempt to delay this scheme, and why national Democrats are beginning to realize it's time to use the power of their majorities in huge blue states to fight fire with fire. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Democrat of Texas, was in the state legislature 4 years ago when she and other Democratic members left the state to try to prevent new Republican voting restrictions. She joins me now. It's how we got to know you, really. You were Texas state legislator, Jasmine Crockett. This is wild. They're not sugarcoating this at all. They're telling you what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Oh, I mean, they are trying to sugarcoat it a little bit. You just played a clip of Representative Hunter, and I was there when he was given those remarks. And when asked by another colleague whether or not they were doing this at the prompting of the Department of Justice, at the prompting of Donald Trump, he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And they were like, but you do realize that Donald Trump said he wanted 5 seats, and this map gives him 5 seats. He's like, I haven't heard that. So I'm just like, what are we doing, right? Like, I mean, seriously, how is it that you haven't heard that? And this is just your magic number that you came up with. Yeah.
Coincidentally, the same as Donald Trump's magic number. Talk to me about people across this country, Democrats in particular, who are having a personal and emotional struggle with the idea that they feel like political partisan gerrymandering, obviously racial gerrymandering is supposed to be against the law, but political partisan gerrymandering is a bad thing, and a lot of these states have moved to bipartisan commissions because redistricting does have to happen, populations change. How do you feel about the struggle that some Democrats are having with this right now?
Listen, I think that the struggle is good because it means that you still have a moral compass. Unfortunately, in the government that we are enduring at this moment, there is no morality. There is nothing but lawlessness, and there is nothing but power grabs at the expense of so many innocent people. And if we are going to preserve our democracy in this moment, this is the way that we have to engage in this fight. Now, once we get control back, listen, Democrats, I need y'all to listen to me clearly when I say that once we get control back, we have to be just as aggressive, if not more aggressive than the Republicans, to do right by the people. It is time for us to rebuild the trust with the American people. Unfortunately, They did not trust us, and that's exactly why we got here. It's not because Donald Trump is so great. It's not because he put up such great numbers. Unfortunately, so many Democrats stayed at home because they just did not believe that we would fight for them. But this is why I'm so proud of my former colleagues from the State House, because Texas Democrats, well, we do everything bigger in Texas, including fight as Democrats.
So let's talk about what happens here. And I think this might be why some people across the country are struggling with this. This is not a Texas problem. If Texas creates 5 more House of Representative seats, that's an America thing, right? That could be the distinction. That could be the difference between Republicans keeping hold of Congress in the midterm elections or not.
No, it absolutely could be. I mean, think about it this way. Right now, the Democrats should control the House, but we don't. And the only reason we don't control the House isn't because we didn't work hard, isn't because we didn't raise money, isn't because we didn't put up good candidates, but it is because North Carolina, as soon as they ended up with a Republican majority on that Supreme Court, decided to redraw the lines again. And instead of that state being 7-7, which sounds like how that state has historically been voting, instead now the congressional delegation is 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats. They took 3 seats away from us, and those 3 seats would have made the difference in having a Speaker Johnson and a Speaker Jeffries. And, well, one of those is bigger, better, and greater than the other, and I'm sure you know which one that is.
Let's talk about what the options are here. California is looking at an option that says, let's put this to a vote and let the voters say that they've got a right to do mid-decade redistricting. New York is ready to trigger a bill that says if somebody else does it, we can fight back. Illinois, of course, being particularly helpful to those Texas Democrats, who, by the way, Senator John Cornyn has asked the FBI to get involved and find, arrest, or bring back the Texas legislators.
Yeah, this is interesting. Clearly, my senator. Now, listen, I'm about to tell all of MSNBC a secret. I actually don't hate Senator Cornyn at all. And right now, what we have is a senator who actually is a real Republican who's doing everything that he can to make it seem like he's a MAGA Republican so that he can get through his primary. But Senator Cornyn, this is not him. This is somebody that sat on our Supreme Court in the state of Texas. This is somebody who typically works in a very bipartisan way, unlike Senator Cruz. This is somebody who is literally doing everything that he can to hopefully get some of that MAGA base that is riled up to vote for our corrupt attorney general, because now I'm convinced the only way that you can succeed with MAGA is you got to cheat on your wife, you got to have some felonies hanging over your head, you got to do something that makes you a little saucy before they will get behind you. And that's exactly who A.G. Paxton is. And unfortunately, he is consistently leading in the primary polls on the Republican side. And so Senator Cornyn knows that the FBI can't get involved and ain't going to get involved as it relates to some little civil situation that was signed off on by the Speaker of the Texas House. But the MAGA base won't know that.
Are you concerned that Paxton might get away with this business of trying to expel Texas legislators?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Because I know the Texas Constitution. So the only way that he gets away with that is if our Supreme Court decides that they want to throw away our Constitution. And frankly, the only thing that we've seen these courts really stand by just a little bit has been the Constitution. And in 2021, when I broke quorum, there were a number of court cases that came about. And this particular Supreme Court said that this was a political issue, and therefore they had no ability to step in and to preside over it. And so I think that they'll arrive at the same conclusion, because our Texas state constitution specifically allows for and talks about a quorum break. And that's why this isn't the first or the second or the third quorum break in the history of the state of Texas.
The former Texas legislator and current United States House of Representative member Jasmine Crockett. Good to see you again. Thank you for being with us tonight.
There being 94 members present, a quorum is not present.
So that was the Texas House Speaker today, gaveling out until Friday, because more than 50 Democrats fled to 3 blue states Sunday in protest to deny Republicans from voting and approving their new, very gerrymandered maps. Texas law requires that 100 members be present for a quorum. And we're at this point because Texas Governor Greg Abbott has insisted, at the request of Trump, that the legislature jam through new congressional maps because Republicans are freaked out about losing the House next year. Abbott and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton have previously threatened to both arrest and vacate the seats of Democrats who are taking this stand if they do not return to Texas. And it appears that effort has officially begun. Earlier this evening, in just the last couple of hours, Abbott filed a lawsuit asking the state Supreme Court to kick state rep and Democratic caucus leader Gene Wu out of his duly elected seat. The lawsuit also accuses Wu of, quote, soliciting and receiving certain benefits in exchange for skipping a vote. But despite all of these fear tactics, Representative Wu is not backing down. And joining me now is Democratic leader and state representative Gene Wu. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have had quite a day, to put it mildly. Let me just start by asking you, I mean, Governor Abbott is trying to kick you out of your seat, accusing you and other Democrats of soliciting money to pay fines, which I will just note, this is in part because they could charge Democrats up to $500 a day, and there's been an effort to raise money to cover that expense, right? That's why we're here. But what is your reaction to this lawsuit from the governor?
It's simply insanity. Look, I mean, first of all, this seat doesn't belong to me. The church cell doesn't belong to the governor. This seat belongs to the people of the state of Texas, and I took an oath to protect them and defend them. And when the governor conspires with a corrupt president to use illegal, unconstitutional racial gerrymandering to strip power from hardworking communities who have spent decades building up their power, building up their voice, only to have President Trump steal it from them, I took an oath to defend against that, an oath to defend those communities, an oath to defend the Constitution.
Donald Trump said again today that he is entitled to 5 seats in Texas, which is pretty outrageous. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that comment. I mean, you spoke about the governor. What do you think about that?
No, I mean, this is exactly what a king would say. Americans know what they're seeing. They may not be able to put words to it quite yet, but they know that this is wrong. It smells wrong. And they know that this is the lead up to authoritarianism, that this is what despots and dictators do around the world. We have fought wars against people like this. We have sacrificed lives to free people from dictators like this, who do these kind of things, who use the legal process, use law enforcement to go hunt down their enemies, hunt down people who disagree with them, and use any means necessary to silence them. This is not America. And if you think that this is wrong, we need people to stand up now.
I think just so I know people watching have been following this closely, but Trump also mentioned that the FBI may have to be used to go after Democratic elected officials who are out of the state, which is an absolutely insane thing to say. But I want to know your thoughts on that. What are your caucus colleagues saying about that?
Yeah. So we knew going into this that this was a possibility. We knew that Governor Abbott, Senator Cornyn, Ken Paxton, none of them have power outside of the state and can do anything outside of the state. And we know that Donald Trump and the FBI and whoever else he has cannot get involved unless they are legally allowed to get involved. Our issue is, will they actually follow the law? And we've watched Governor Abbott, Ken Paxton, and especially Donald Trump just flout the law, just does not care what the law says, or especially what the Constitution of the United States says. That is why we're here. That is why we're doing this. We are tired, just like the people in this country. We're tired of corrupt politicians. We are tired of the corrupt process. We're tired of politicians telling us nice things to our face and then turning around and doing the opposite and just taking care of themselves, taking care of their buddies. Enough. We have said enough, and we want the people of the state of Texas to say enough. And most importantly, we need the people of the United States to say enough.
I can hear in your voice and seeing your passion. You are not backing down. I think it is incredibly inspiring to see. You also are helping lead this group, and you have to keep enough people from going back to Texas and allowing them to have a quorum to move forward. You're trying to do this at the time when the governor is threatening to try to take people's seats away, when the Trump is talking about the FBI. How are those conversations going? And how confident do you feel you're going to be able to keep enough Democrats from going back before the end of this session, at least?
So all the Democrats who are here, we had lengthy discussions about this, about the dangers of doing this before we did it. We had long discussions. Everybody who is here recognizes the danger to them personally, recognizes the danger to their families, recognizes danger to their communities. But we have all agreed that for us to do nothing is far worse. For us to be complicit in the destruction of communities across the state would be immoral and unethical, would be a violation of our oaths. And all of us have taken oaths to swear to defend the United States, to defend the Constitution of the United States, and to defend her people. We take this oath very seriously, and that is why we're here. We will stand up against Trump. We will stand up against Abbott or whoever they have to throw at us. We will fight to our last breath to save this nation.
Joining us now, New York Times Chief White House Correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, and U.S. National Editor for the Financial Times, Ed Luce, and former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and former chief economist and economic policy advisor to Vice President Biden, Jared Bernstein. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Jared, Steve Bannon is pushing hard for the chief economist for the Heritage Foundation, who is also a contributor to Project 2025. Now that is even being floated out in the ether, what are your thoughts?
This is a really very, very troublesome development. You're talking about stacking the deck at an institution with tremendous statistical integrity, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You talk about someone with great credibility and experience in the field. That defines Erica McIntyre, who, by the way, used to work for me at the Council of Economic Advisors. A meticulous statistician with zero thumbs anywhere near the scales. They're clearly trying to stack the court here because the real data is impinging on their alternative reality where everything's fine. And they can shoot all the messengers they want, but they will not be successful because the truth will out. People know that affordability continues to be a challenge, that job growth continues to be a challenge. And all this is going to do is discredit the administration and the broader country in terms of the world's eyes.
So if you know McIntyre, is it even possible to rig the data as the president has suggested? Is that something you think she would have even been capable of doing?
No, she would not have been capable of doing that. The numbers are locked by the time the commissioner gets them. She can't go in there and change 4.2 unemployment to 3.2 unemployment. It's just these folks have just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the process works. And look, we can get into the weeds all day, and we should. You're absolutely right. But what they're doing here is incredibly transparent. Again, economic reality, which is going south at a pretty decent rate, is impinging on their alternative reality where everything's fine. And it's their policy agenda, which is to blame.
Okay, so dovetailing off of that point there, Ed, does President Trump's baseless claims that the job numbers are subject to political manipulation send some kind of signal to whoever comes next and make them less likely to release the credible data that's out there?
For sure, it sends that kind of signal. And he's shown that, he's prepared to fire anybody, up to and possibly including Jerome Powell, who doesn't do his bidding. It is, though, as Jared says, and Jared knows far better than I, that cooking the economic statistics just by a stroke of the pen, which appears to be what President Trump wants the next chief of the BLS to do is something that you'll get caught red-handed doing straight away. And the markets will react. Employees at the Bureau of Labor Statistics will react. It will come out. This is not really the way of addressing the problem that Trump sees as harming him, namely much lower job growth than he was hoping for. The way to tackle that is to pursue more sound economic policies. And at the moment, he shows no signs of revisiting those.
Peter, you've written that Trump's efforts echo an authoritarian playbook, but firing McEntarfer, is that another bridge you weren't expecting him to cross?
Yeah, I think that what you've seen with President Trump in the past is a willingness to play loose with the facts, to make up numbers, to spread falsehoods, lies, conspiracy theories. But what we're seeing in the second term is a desire and intent to force the rest of government and sometimes other institutions in society to adopt his false version of reality, right? He told everybody in the first term that his crowd size was bigger than the official people said. He told everybody running for office in the first time that Obama wasn't actually born in this country, when of course he was. He told everybody after losing in 2020 that he didn't really lose. It was all massive fraud, even though everybody said that's not the case. So now what he's doing is he's making clear to agencies of the government that are typically nonpartisan, they're typically meant to be, just counting numbers and providing data, that if they provide data that he doesn't like, that in his opinion, that's the words he used, my opinion means those data are wrong, that they risk losing their jobs. And we've seen that time and time again in the last few months. Intelligence analysts who produced an assessment he didn't like about Venezuela were pressured to rewrite it. The Smithsonian Institution just last week confirmed that they actually removed Donald Trump's name from an exhibit on impeachments, not because the White House even had to tell them, but because the fear has gone out across the federal government about offending him. Now they've switched gears after being embarrassed by a Washington Post story. But this kind of thing is happening all the time. They're scrubbing data from computers about vaccines and climate change and so forth. So this is a president right now who is trying to enforce his version of the facts on a government that traditionally, provides independent data so that Republicans and Democrats alike can rely on it and make policy decisions.
Peter, your colleagues at the Times put the president's strategy when it comes to tariffs this way: pledge money or get higher tariffs. So we're seeing that the EU is saying they may not be able to make good on their promise of $600 billion in exchange for a bit of a lower tariff rate. Does this appear to be working?
Well, it is, and in some ways, right, he has, in fact, forced a number of major trading partners to go along with some sort of a tariff deal. Now, we can argue about who got the better end of those deals, but we're seeing tariffs basically go up even with those deals, right? The floor seems to be about 15%. Jared can talk about this history better than I can, but I think 15% is a floor for tariffs, across the board, and some countries will get higher than that, is a much higher tariff rate than we've seen in nearly a century. That's a major change in the world economy. But because he threatened so much worse, because he threatened, say, 50, 100%, whatever, people took the 15% and say, well, gosh, that's not so bad. Well, we'll see. We'll see in the next few months. Does that mean that consumer goods start disappearing from the shelves? Does that mean prices start to go up for things people are used to buying? You can scrub the numbers all you want, but if people see that in their own lives, they're going to notice.
So, Ed, a final word to you. We've seen the president leverage these tariffs to push forward his geopolitical agenda. What do you think of that concept when we see it applied to allies like India, Canada? Just a word on that.
So I think, if you're Indian, India has been an ally since a bulwark, a counterbalance against China through successive administrations, including Trump's first administration. If you're India and you're hearing Trump not only threaten more than 25% tariffs, but call you a dead economy and have a one-to-one lunch with the head of the Pakistan army. I mean, presidents don't have, one-to-one lunches with the heads of foreign militaries. Then you're not seeing much geopolitics in this. The geopolitics is pretty hard to figure out. What you are seeing is Trump, with his usual extreme escalatory tactics, attempting to get India to submit in the way that, say, the European Union and Japan and the UK submitted. I suspect, though, that you're going to see India digging in its heels, even though it doesn't have the kind of leverage China has on critical minerals and rare earths. There's a lot of pride and stubbornness and a sort of feeling that this is neo-colonial, what's going on here.